So much for doing that. And now Troy, pastor of Paradox C. There we go. Okay.
Good morning, friends. It's good to see you. And hello to our viewers at home. I was going to say it's good to see you. It's good to be with you in spirit. Hope you're well. Glad you're with us. Can I open with a prayer? Can I be so bold as a pastor to open with a prayer? Spirit of Christ, thank you for being here with us. We invite you to guide our hearts and minds as we, for the next 20 minutes or so, attempt to understand who we are and who you've created and called us to be. We're trying to understand your teachings, Jesus, on being serpent doves, and we invite your Spirit to guide us. I ask that you help my friends here to sift the wheat from the chaff of what comes out of my mouth. And I invite you to guide my mind to share what's important and maybe to just skip over things that aren't that important. Help me to be present with you in the moment so I can sense your leading. And we invite you to be part of our conversation afterwards as we discuss your teachings together in small groups. Thank you for being with us and your promise to guide us and lead us with your spirit of truth. Amen. We're going to kind of dive into maybe what you might call the deep end. Some of you might think it's the shallow end. So let's just call it the middle pool, shall we? And some of it might be confusing, and that's okay. We're going to keep talking about this for the next, few weeks, and I think it will become clear as we keep talking about it, but I'm going to kind of give you an overview today, and so I might be talking about some things that you're just like, what is he talking about? What is he getting at? Just bear with me. Hold on for at least a few weeks and see if it doesn't make sense after a few weeks of explanation. Is that fair? Thank you for your patience. We're talking about Jesus' teaching on being savvy as serpents and pure as doves. So Jesus chooses these two animals with intentionality. He chooses two animals that are very different from one another. You could even say they're kind of opposites, right? So there's a snake, which is the scariest animal on the planet. I mean, culturally, across all cultures, that's an animal that we just instinctively have a fear of. Snakes are scary. And then we have a dove. Nobody's afraid of a dove, right? They're about the most docile creature you can imagine. I mean, if you have a fear of doves, that would be a great story. I'd love to hear that, actually. So maybe you can share next week your story of the scary dove. But for most of us, you're not scared of a dove. Now the other thing, we could talk about their differences all day probably, but another thing is that a snake is about as close to the ground as an animal can get. It doesn't even have little legs to keep it up. It literally slithers on and in the earth. And the dove, of course, lives above the earth. It's in trees and flying in the sky and living in, on ledges in apartment buildings and downtowns. It's way up there. So these are very different animals. And one of the things that Jesus is teaching us is, in order to become serpent doves, we have to learn to contain opposites in our lives, right? We have to learn to embody opposites in our inner beings. And that's not easy for us. What Jesus is doing here, I'm glad you introduced me as the pastor of Paradox. That fits right in here, Stephen. What Jesus is doing here is inviting us into paradoxy. Jesus continually points to paradox. Jesus was a paradox. I mean, Jesus is God, and Jesus is human. Jesus is infinite, and Jesus is finite. Jesus is described as the lamb that was slain, killed by the Romans. Jesus is also the Lion of Judah that is the conqueror and ruler of all. Jesus is paradox. Jesus also teaches us that his kingdom is already here, but it's not yet here, right? Jesus teaches us that the first will be last and the last will be first. Jesus teaches us that you need to die in order to live. So paradoxy is at the heart of who Jesus is, Jesus' teachings, and the way of Jesus that he invites us to live by. That's why the subtitle of this message series is Becoming Your Whole Paradoxical Self. In order to become who you really are, your full self, your whole self, we need to learn to embrace this paradox. And that's difficult for us because we have to hold these contradictions. And that's why Jesus is so provocative with this teaching, be a snake, be a dove. Now there's a deeper layer of paradox here that is even more provocative. The dove and the serpent actually represent, they're not just animals, they represent something. When you hear the word serpent, from a biblical perspective, what do you think of? You probably think of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? That tempts Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's a lot of ofs in that statement. And what that does, okay, well, let's come back to that. That's what we think of with the serpent. When you think of the word dove from a biblical perspective, what do you think of? You probably think of spirit baptism, right? The Holy Spirit. When Jesus was baptized, the Holy Spirit descended and stayed with Jesus in the form of a dove. That's interesting. So the serpent and the dove actually represent two baptisms or two awakenings of humanity. The serpent baptism, the serpent awakening in the Garden of Eden, it introduces humanity to good and evil, dialectic thinking, dualistic thinking. In fact, some describe this Garden of Eden event as when humanity became conscious. That's the consciousness of humanity. And they became conscious, they became self-aware, they became self-conscious actually, didn't they? They all of a sudden didn't notice before that they're naked. Animals don't notice they're naked. Animals live by instinct. In this story, we read of humanity becoming conscious, and a part of consciousness is becoming self-conscious, realizing I am naked, I am vulnerable. Right? And that ties in with the serpent journey. When we realize we're vulnerable, when we become conscious, and that just includes a whole lot of things, not only dualistic thinking, but an ego and all our analytical mind and all these, able to reflect on our experience of life. And what it does is it makes us take the serpent journey because we feel vulnerable. Anyway, we've already talked about that. If you weren't here last week, you can check it out on our YouTube channel. It's about the serpent journey. The second baptism, so that's the first awakening. Let's call it ego consciousness for lack of a better terminology. The second awakening the dove represents is spirit baptism, spirit awakening. So the serpent awakening is when we become aware of our, let's call it ego and earthly existence. We become aware of ourselves. And that's quite a journey we've taken in becoming aware of ourselves. The second journey we take, the second awakening, is the spirit awakening, which is we don't become aware of ourselves, we become aware of divine presence within us. And Jesus is saying both of these awakenings, both of these baptisms are important. This is interesting stuff to me. So you could say that, well, you could say a lot of things. Why don't I move along? Because I got a lot to cover. But the dove journey is this spirit awakening. It's becoming aware of divine spirit within you. And becoming aware that your true self is interconnected with divine spirit within you. Now let's go to the Greek, because it wouldn't be a sermon without some Greek. The word here is akarios. There's different ways of pronouncing it. That's what I'm choosing to go with. Akarios. And akarios, so be akarios as doves, Jesus says. Akarios means simple, pure, unmixed, undiluted. So two of the common usages of the Greek word akarios would have been for wine. I like wine. You like wine? I looked at the kids. That was okay. Akarios, wine, was pure wine. Pure wine. It wasn't watered down. It wasn't diluted with water. It had one ingredient. It was simple, pure, essence of pure wine. Another example, gold. Pure gold. Akarios gold was pure gold. It wasn't mixed in with other metals to come up with some alloy or, 12 karat gold. Pure gold, one ingredient, pure, essential. So your Akarios self is your pure self, your essential self, who you really are, untainted by the world, untainted by your experiences and wounds in the world. It's who you really are. It's you, the you that does not die when your body takes its last breath. It's you, your pure essence that is uninformed by your wounds, by your fears, by the conditioning, by the socialization and normalization process that we are all exposed to, that eventually leads us to these beliefs. We believe in order to be happy and fulfilled in life, we need to be other than we are, and we need reality to be other than we are. Now, these are subconscious beliefs. We're not always constantly aware of those beliefs, but they manifest in our lives all the time. These two beliefs. In order to be truly happy and fulfilled, reality has to be other than it is, and I have to be other than I am. And because of these two foundational beliefs that are deeply embedded in our psyche, often in our subconscious, there's an inner conflict, a struggle, a tension in our lives. And it manifests in a number of ways. And in a sense, that's why we take our serpent journey that I talked about the last couple of weeks, is because we're trying to cope with this internal struggle, this internal tension, internal conflict. We're trying to cope and try and find tools and techniques to help us live with reality as it is, even though we believe deep down if we're truly going to be happy and truly fulfilled in life, reality has to change. And in order to be truly happy and truly fulfilled, we have to be something or someone else. So there's this inner conflict that we live with. It's called the human condition. And something that's interesting is some biologists and psychologists and sociologists are talking about the escalating angst and anxiety and anger and stress and tension within individuals and collectively as societies. And I think they're right. We're seeing this, right? Is anyone else noticing? and obviously, there's not one reason for this. It could not be more complex, but one reason that I've heard explained is we go through, and this is not new. I mean, revolutions, wars, all this, it's happened before, it'll happen again. There's nothing new under the sun. Human beings, even societies, we typically go through cycles. And periodically, the tension and the conflict and the stress of the human condition comes to the surface, and we need to do something about it. And I think we're living in one of those times now. But one of the reasons for this is we go through cycles of trusting in some external power or structure or system or leader that we think is going to help make the world make sense for us and is going to help make the world fair or safe or make the world great again, whatever terminology you want to use there. But when you start feeling your life and the world is turning upside down, we often turn to leaders, external somethings to make it all make sense. And right now we're going through another period of where just this week another two Christian leaders went down, and that's just becoming, it's not even news anymore. Like religion has had its day is kind of how most people feel right now. So at one point in history, we look to religion. Okay, religion's going to help us make sense of the world and make the world fair and make the world safe. Most people aren't looking to that anymore. Or we look to governments, and most of us aren't looking to that anymore. Or we look to the economy or science. And many people are kind of thinking the technological progress of science is more likely to be our undoing than saving us at this point, right? So we look to all these external things that at one point in our history have said, okay, we can trust them, we can relax, things are going to be okay. We don't have a lot of that we can look to, right? So this anxiety, this unrest, this tension, this human condition, inner conflict comes to the surface. And no matter how many times we take the serpent journey, how deep we go into the serpent journey, it's not going to resolve that inner conflict. And what Jesus is teaching us in this passage and throughout most of his teachings, it's the dove journey is the only way to resolve this inner conflict. And what happens on the dove journey is that we discover and access our true self, our pure self, the essential self that is untainted by the world and our experiences and our fears and our wounds and everything that's going on out there. We're going to unpack that more, but I'm going to move on. Hopefully it's making sense. If not, like I said, in a few weeks, I think it'll all come together. I actually believe that. So, here's one way of differentiating the dove journey and the serpent journey. The serpent journey is about changing who you are and changing how you function and live in the world so that you can cope, so that you can survive and thrive. The dove journey is not about changing who you are or changing. It's about discovering who you really are and then manifesting that. So that's the fundamental difference between the two. Now, we're going to dive a bit into the inner being and the different parts in our inner being. We're actually going to be talking about that for the next few weeks. This is where things get fascinating to me. So let's talk a little psychology. You know, the ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, all of them, they were doing psychology. It wasn't called psychology, but they were trying to understand the inner being, the psyche. Jesus was doing psychology. He was trying to help us understand the human psyche. Paul has some really interesting comments on the inner psyche and what's going on in our inner beings. But modern psychology didn't really become a thing till, the mid-1800s or late 1800s. And that's when psychologists, like Freud, he's the famous one, right, began examining and mapping the inner beings, the psyche of human beings. And they started talking about different parts within us, or different layers or levels within us. Like most of you have probably heard the 3 levels of consciousness. That we are conscious beings, we have a subconscious mind, and we have an unconscious mind, right? So that's one way of talking about it. Freud talked about the different parts of the inner being. He named them the id and the ego and the superego, and most of Freud's thoughts and work is kind of outdated. But one of his contemporaries, Carl Jung, took this to another level, this examination and mapping out of different parts within us. And many of the thoughts and the work of Carl Jung are still at play today. And Carl Jung and Jungian psychology has been incredibly informative in my own journey. Jung talked about the inner parts within us in a number of ways, but 2 big ones would be archetypes and complexes. Now, archetypes, I already did a whole message series on that, so I'm not going to talk about archetypes today. Anyone remember the archetype? The inner orphan? Yeah. Let's talk about complexes, because I've talked about archetypes enough. But most of you have probably heard that term, complex. That person has a complex. Have you heard that phrase? That's part of our common psychological language now. Like, that person has an inferiority complex. That person has a martyr complex. That person has a God complex, right? Now, we're familiar with this term, but we probably don't fully understand what Jung and Jungian psychologists mean by that. But we have a basic idea of it. Here's an overview of, it might be helpful, it might not, but let's think of in terms of organisms. There are simple organisms, there are complex organisms. Well, a complex is a complex organism within you, psychological organism. It's more than that, actually, but let's just think in terms of a simple organism would be a false belief or a limiting belief or an idea or a wound that you have or a habit. It could be, that's a simple organism in terms of organisms, but a complex organism will be, some of those things come together, coalesce and form a more complex organism, and they actually develop a personality and some physiology. Let me, if that isn't helping things, I'm sure this will. I'll give you the actual words of Carl Jung. In 1935, he described a complex as having the tendency to form a little personality of itself. It has a sort of body, a certain amount of its own physiology. It can upset the stomach. It upsets the breathing. It disturbs the heart. In short, it behaves like a partial personality. I hold that our personal unconscious and subconscious consists of an indefinite number of complexes or fragmentary personalities. Now, this may sound kind of strange to you, right? But many psychologists since young have observed that we contain a number of sub-personalities or parts within us. And that sounds kind of weird. You're like, are you saying we all have multiple personalities? Sort of. I mean, not a pathological multiple personality disorder, but there's something psychologists talk about, the normal multiplicity of the mind. And that's what we're talking about here. We all have these different parts within us. Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed in someone else, maybe they get triggered, and all of a sudden, it's like they become a different person? Have you ever seen that? Or maybe someone has had a little too much to drink, and you see a different side of them that you've never seen before. Or maybe you see someone who you normally see in a certain setting, and then you see them in a different setting. Maybe you see them with their siblings and their parents, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, okay, definitely seems to be something different going on there. Maybe you see someone for the first time, you see them engaged in conflict, and you're like, whoa, that is a completely different energy I've never sensed in them before. Have you ever sensed kind of a Jekyll and Hyde thing in someone else? I mean, through this pandemic, come on. Who haven't you sensed that in, right? Have you ever said this about someone else? Wow, that was really out of character. Have you ever said they do something, you're like, wow, that really surprised me. And what that means is they just did something that didn't fit the narrative that you have of who they are, right? And maybe you've said this when someone you know who's ordinarily just a great person, wonderful, delightful person, then all of a sudden they do something kind of awful, maybe really selfish or mean or vindictive, and maybe you've said this, whoa, they're really showing their true colors now. Have you ever said that? That's an interesting thing. Interesting that we would think, that person at their worst, well, that's who they really are. And we often do that. 90% of the time, this person can be just absolutely wonderful, generous, kind, compassionate. And then, 5% of the time, they're just selfish. But no, that 5%, mathematically speaking, that's who they really are. It's interesting. That's based on assumptions we have about the world we live in, reality. But that's also how we treat ourselves a lot of the times. Most of you, I know most of you to some degree, and you seem like great people to me. But I bet you there's times when you think, that 5%, when you lose your cool, when you yell at your kids, when you do something selfish, when you do something whatever, and you probably think, oh man, that's who I really am. If people really know, imposter syndrome, right? This 90%, you're doing all this fantastic stuff, but if people knew who I really was, 3% of the time. It's interesting how all the assumptions and beliefs that we have that form our grid for interacting with ourselves in reality. Now, coming back to the point, have you ever done something and said, I can't believe I just said that. I can't believe I just did that. I can't believe I just thought that. Where did that thought come from? That's not me. Have you ever thought that? That can't be me. That's not who I am. Well, then who is it? Who is that? The reason we act in contradictory ways, in conflicting ways, is because we have these different parts within us, different competing sub-personalities. And in case you're thinking, this doesn't sound very biblical, well, then let me bring a Bible verse into it. Paul, Romans chapter 7. He says, I don't understand my actions. I don't understand why I keep doing the things I hate. I don't understand why I keep doing things I don't want to do. I don't understand why I don't do the things I want to do. That might be the most honest and relatable passage of Scripture in the entire Bible. It's the human condition. And what's interesting is if you continue reading Paul's writings, he answers this question. It's because there's different parts in you. That's the biblical answer that Paul comes up with. Now, he uses different terminology, but if you turned that terminology into Greek, it would sound just as weird as words like complex and archetype. Like sarx. How does that grab you? I'm actually writing half a book on sarx. That's the word for flesh. That's the word for flesh. And Paul says, it's actually not my true self. It's not me who's doing those things. That's a very interesting thing to say, right? Now, I don't want to get too much into that, but it's fascinating to me. But what Paul is saying is there are parts within me, subpersonalities, dynamics, energies that actually kind of take over in my life and behave in certain ways that my true self wants nothing to do with, that my true self would never do. Now, I know that kind of sounds like the devil made me do it. Is he taking responsibility for his actions? He is. He's just trying to explain the complexity of the inner psyche 2,000 years ago, using the language that he had back then. So the different parts within you that he talks about will be the power of sin and the flesh, sarx, things like that, because that's the language of his day. Now we have more language. Let's thank God that we have more language. It's amazing, incredible. But the point is there are different parts within us. But Paul says that's not who I am. My true self is, well, let's talk about that. Are we ready to talk about that? I didn't bring my phone up. When I really get into it, I lose track of time. Someone tell me what time it is. 10:52. I know you say that. Oh, man. It's good to see you, brother. I know I'm not. Okay, no, I'm not going there. Here we go. Back to the point at hand. I only have, let's say, 3 minutes left. The point of the dove journey. Let's get back to the point of the dove journey. It's not to get rid or eliminate these sub-personalities, these different parts within us. I mean, good luck trying to do that. They're kind of there. They're there. And they're not bad. I mean, these different parts, it's complicated, but they are there for a reason. At a certain point in your life, you probably needed them to survive. Let's just put it that. That's a simple way of referring to them. So they're not bad, but they need to be healed. They need to be healed, and they also need to let go of control of your life. The problem is when they start taking the reins of your life. So here's the process of healing and liberation that happens. All these different inner parts within you need to get to know your true self, your pure self, your dove self. Get to know your true self and begin to trust your true self. See, all these parts within you are looking, to these external leaders, these external systems and institutions and traditions and powers, and that's why we keep falling for, these leaders who it baffles the mind why we keep falling for certain leaders, but humanity always has, we always will. And because we want to know that someone or something can make the world make sense for us. And this dove journey is about discovering a natural inner leader within us that we can trust, that is far more trustworthy than anything out there. And that natural leader within us is our true self, our pure self. It is what Paul calls Christ in you. It is the part of you that is the image of God. It is the part of you that is one with the vine, Jesus says. It's the part of you that is interconnected with the divine, with God. And when your parts meet and get to know the true self, they start to relax. Because when our parts take over, they're taking over because they're trying to help us survive. They're trying to help us cope with the reality we live in. I'll give you an example. One of my inner parts, he's Overeater Troy. He's strong. He's a powerful part. He loves food. He's convinced me I love food all the time. But he's not a bad guy, really. He just loves to have a good time, really. He loves the taste. But what he's really doing is he's trying to help me cope with my stress and the snake-filled world that I live in. His intentions are not malicious. But having said that, I don't want him running my life, right? Just not a good idea. So it's not that I'm trying to get rid of Overeater Troy. I just don't want him in control. But the only way that Overeater Troy is going to relax and see that I don't need to eat in order to cope with stress and all this stuff that's going on, is to discover this inner leader within me that okay, I can trust true Troy. I can trust pure Troy. I can trust essential Troy. He's got this. He's got this. Everything's going to be okay. Does that make sense? I know you still don't fully understand what I mean by true self, but that's the trajectory we were trying to do. So eventually we want all these parts and sub-personalities within us to be relating to the world and to one another, because that's what happens with us, is we have conflict going on in us between different parts. You ever feel like you're as if there's inner conflict in your life? Well, that's because there is. These different competing parts wanting different things, vying for power and attention. So the more that these parts learn to relate to one another and to reality through their relationship with the true self, you begin to move towards wholeness, freedom, and liberation. Okay, that's a lot. I want to leave you with one more thing. One more thing. It's an exercise that can kind of get you started on the dove journey. And it's a question. So the next time that you're asking yourself a question, we all talk to ourselves, right? We like to think, oh, the person talks to themselves, they must be. We all talk, we just don't do it out loud. Maybe some of us do, you know? I remember once I was on my paper route when I was like 11 years old, and I just got in this weird habit of just like talking like full-on conversations with myself out loud. And I remember one time, all of a sudden I heard a voice of a cute girl that I kind of liked saying, "Are you talking to me? Or who are you talking to?" And I had no response. I mean, I was just fully caught, just really engaged with myself. So I've learned over time to keep those conversations an inner monologue. But the reality is we all talk to ourselves. There's a constant narrator. Try and pay attention to it. You know, it's like, oh, I got to get to the bank later on this week. There's a voice in there. There's a voice in there. So this voice sometimes asks you questions. Maybe you're encountering something. You're like, is this true? Or is this right? Is this wrong? Can I trust this person? Should I really forgive this person? Whatever the question is, follow it up with another question. And that question is this: who is asking? Who is asking the question? Or maybe you make a statement in your mind. You know, lately it seems like everybody's got statements about political leaders. There's just a lot of political. So you make a statement about Trudeau or Doug Ford or Putin or Biden or whoever. Take your pick. I'm sure you've made a statement about one of them. And the next time you make a statement, just stop. Okay, who is making the statement? And what you'll discover as you take this dove journey, you will begin to realize that most of the time you are not operating from your true self, your pure self, your essential self, that part of you that is one with God. Most of the time, it's one of these parts, one of these sub-personalities that's controlling the inner narration in your mind and therefore influencing your behavior, expectations, desires, etc. Make sense? So as you ask this question, now how can you tell if it's your true self? And with this, I promise I will close. How can you tell it is your true self? Well, Richard Schwartz, who's really been helpful to me, I discovered his work over my sabbatical. And he is a psychotherapist, founder of Internal Family Systems psychotherapy model. He is adjunct faculty member at the Department of Psychotherapy at Harvard Medical School. So there's some credentials there, right? And he makes a list of a bunch of C words. I love it. Is he a pastor? He's using alliteration. I love it. You know, a bunch of C words that help you identify if it's your true self or not. And so I'll just run through them and then we'll be done. And if they're helpful, maybe I'll put them on the Facebook page or something, or get them out there somehow, because I think you'll want them. Your true self, Christ in you. Your true self is always calm. Always calm. If you're in an agitated state, frustrated, anxious, whatever, that's not your true self. You're not operating from true self. That doesn't mean it's bad. This isn't about judgment, right? It's just a matter, this whole growth journey is about awareness, just becoming aware. And it's very helpful to know when you're not operating out of your true self and when you are. True self is always compassionate. If you're not feeling compassion for others, the people that you're thinking about or whatever, that's not your true self. True self is always connected. If you're not feeling connected to others, to the earth, to the cosmos, to God, that's not your true self. True self is always confident. Your true self is always curious. It's So when you make a judgment, that's not curious. The true self doesn't say, oh, that person is such and such. The true self is like, that is really interesting. I wonder why that person said that. I wonder what's going on in their lives. I wonder where they're coming from. I wonder why I reacted to their state. Always curious, the true self. True self is always clear. If you're swirling in confusion, that's not true self. True self is courageous. It is creative, not destructive, always creative. True self is consistent. And your true self is always content. You know, like David, Psalm 23, God is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing. When you're operating from true self, even if you're going through hard times, you experience fulfillment, contentment. You are plugged into the abundance that is the present moment. You are so tuned into the fact that this moment is gift. It is an absolute gift and blessing. You feel contentment. That doesn't mean you don't feel pain and sorrow and all that stuff, but in the midst of that, you still feel a contentment, a fulfillment. All right. Stephen, you're coming up now? See, he didn't start moving because he knew I was going to say, and one more thing. Email me I think my email is somewhere on our website. Email me if you want that information, or I'll put it on our Facebook page.
Thank you so much, Troy. I'm excited to see where it goes from here, but we are going to connect with one another for now. We're going to do some discussion. This is completely optional. If you need to slip out, that is fine. There is no obligation. But for those of you that are going to stay and discuss, let me explain what that looks like. If you are a junior youth, grade 6, 7, 8, you're going to meet in that back corner. If you are senior youth, which is high school, you're going to be behind the stage. For all of you not in those categories, you are going to stay here in groups of about 8. 8 is a good number. I mean, 7 is a little more biblical, but 8 is a good number to have discussion and enjoyment, diversity, but you're not talking over each other. Here's something that we do in the youth group. We always start our discussions with guidelines. Not because rules are important, but because rules actually help us have better conversations than without them. They give us structure. And so let me go over our guidelines. You can meet for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will close our service. Guidelines, ready? You do not have to speak if you don't want to, because we all have different learning styles. You can ask or say anything as long as you're not hurting other people. This is a safe and confidential space. And let's listen when other people are talking, because maybe they have something really profound to say, and we want to hear that. Cool? 8-ish people in your groups. So good to see you. Let's have some good discussion.